This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Marc.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? What the hell is going on, Marc? Honestly, what the hell is not going on?
What the hell is going on is the NATO summit, and which has been completely overshadowed by Joe Biden's travails, but not for us foreign policy nerds who care about these things. I had a big full-page essay in the Washington Post this week on how Trump can make NATO great again. and laying out a MAGA agenda for NATO that I think most conservatives could get behind. And I think that Trump could get behind. And I'm hoping that he will.
Me too. One of the ironies that came out, among the many, many ironies that came out in the recent conversations with Joe Biden, was him claiming credit for NATO's revitalization, NATO's resuscitation. If I could pick one person who deserves no credit for this, it's Joe Biden. One, Donald Trump does actually deserve a lot of credit, but number two, Vladimir Putin deserves a lot of credit.
Yes.
Right. Well, our enemies remind us of what we could be. So I want to hear your piece.
So this is a part of our new series, What the Hell Extra, or our subtitle for it, What the Hell Did I Write This Week? And so what we're doing is, as we've done in the last couple of, and I hope we hope you're liking this. If you do like it, please let us know. If you don't like it and want us to stop, please tell us that as well. But we're reading some of our pieces, our work that we've done, and then we're talking about it a little bit. This week, we're doing my piece on NATO.
So, Marc, your piece is entitled, How Trump Can Make NATO Great Again. The Alliance Needs a MAGA Makeover for the Threats of the 21st Century. It appeared in the Washington Post on July 8th. Read it to us, baby.
All right. So as NATO gathers for its 75th anniversary summit in Washington this week, President Biden's taking credit for the fact that European allies and Canada have increased defense spending by hundreds of billions of dollars. And he's warning that if elected, Donald Trump will, quote, eviscerate NATO. In fact, it's Trump, not Biden, who's responsible for most of that spending increase. In 2006, allies pledged to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. But when Trump took office a decade later, only 3 were meeting that commitment. And spending by non-U.S. NATO members had dropped to an all-time low of 1.4% in 2015. The situation was so bad that in Germany, NATO's wealthiest European member, 60% of the country's Eurofighter and Tornado jet fighters, 82% of its Sea Lynx helicopters, 61% of its main battle tanks, and all of its submarines and transport planes were unusable. As president, Trump put Germany and the rest of NATO on notice. The United States would no longer tolerate their failure to contribute adequately to our common defense. And by the time he left office, allies were spending $130 billion more on defense than they did in 2016, and they had pledged to increase that figure to $400 billion by the end of 2024. Well, 2024 has arrived, and NATO data shows that non-U.S. members are projected to spend $510 billion more than they did in 2016, excluding Finland and Sweden, which were not members back then, and whose entire defense budgets now count toward European totals. That's why some of those numbers are inflated. That means almost 80% of the new spending by those countries is due to commitments made during Trump's presidency. The rest can be credited, as Dany said, that's not in the piece, but I'm saying it, can be credited as much to Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine as to any diplomacy from Biden. In other words, the defense investment successes that NATO celebrates this week are primarily a Trump achievement. In the wake of Biden's disastrous debate performance last month and historically low public approval, it seems increasingly likely that Trump will reassume the presidency and thus leadership of the NATO alliance come January. That would be good news for NATO, because any fair-minded assessment of the records of the 2 U.S. presidents shows clearly that it is Trump, not Biden, who is the better candidate to reshape the alliance to meet the threats of this century. Far from eviscerating the Atlantic Alliance, Trump left it militarily stronger than it had been at any time since the end of the Cold War. In a second term, he would have the opportunity not just to further strengthen NATO, but to fundamentally transform it. How might Trump put his stamp on NATO if he wins in November? These 6 planks can form a Trump-NATO agenda that builds on the accomplishment of his first term. Number 1, raise the NATO spending floor from 2 to 3% of GDP. The world is on fire. Wars are raging on 2 continents. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are forming interlocking strategic partnerships with which to threaten America and its democratic allies. As General Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, recently told Congress, these developments represent a threat, quote, more cohesive and dangerous than any threat the United States has faced in decades, end quote. In the face of this threat, spending just 2% of GDP on defense is no longer sufficient. When he took office, Trump told allies they should double their defense spending to 4% of GDP. That might be a bridge too far for most allies, but Polish President Andrzej Duda recently proposed raising NATO's defense spending floor to 3% of GDP. That is achievable. At the height of the Cold War, non-US NATO members spent an average of 3.5% of GDP on defense. There is no reason they couldn't do the same today. Number 2, enshrine the new spending levels in the North Atlantic Treaty. It took almost 2 decades for most NATO allies to meet their 2% spending commitment. And even now, despite witnessing the first major land invasion in Europe since World War II, more than a quarter are still projected to fall short. That is unacceptable. The only way to change this is to impose real consequences for shirking spending commitments. Trump should insist that all allies make a binding pledge to carry their weight. Just as he renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, he should demand the North Atlantic Treaty be amended to include a 3% minimum defense spending requirement, so that it carries the same weight as the principle of collective defense enshrined in Article 5. Doing so would strengthen NATO's deterrence, not weaken it. If all NATO nations meet the new higher defense investments, NATO will be the most powerful military alliance in the history of the world. And creating a new spending obligation would bolster public support for the alliance's security guarantees. A new Ronald Reagan Institute poll finds that 72% of Americans support the United States as responding with military force if a NATO ally in Europe were attacked, including roughly 8 in 10 Democrats and 7 in 10 Republicans. But that support plummets 20 points if the country under attack is not meeting its spending commitments. Americans don't like free riders. They agree with Trump when he says that he will not defend allies who fail to contribute adequately to our collective defense. What if some countries balk? If allies value the Article 5 security guarantee, which is the core of the alliance, they will not put it at risk by refusing reasonable obligations. If they do, Trump might just be tempted to walk away from the alliance altogether, just as he threatened to pull out of NAFTA if Canada and Mexico did not agree to restructure that agreement. Indeed, he is probably the only president who could credibly make such a threat, which means he is the only president who can get allies to agree to these necessary binding changes. Trump has said he 100% wants to remain in the alliance, so long as allies carry their weight. He is right to insist that they do. Indeed, he should insist that they carry more. 3. Launch a second Trump defense buildup. While many of our European allies have increased their defense spending as a percentage of GDP, U.S. defense spending has been falling over the last 4 years. President Biden has put the United States on track to spend the lowest percentage of GDP on defense since 1999, when President Bill Clinton claimed a misguided post-Cold War peace dividend. Indeed, Biden would have reduced defense spending even more but for the Republican takeover of the House. If this downward trend is not reversed, U.S. defense spending could soon plunge to the lowest level in at least 7 decades. The time has come for a second Trump defense buildup. Trump should increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, as Senate Republicans have proposed, so the United States can grow the Navy, add hundreds of jet fighters, accelerate production of the B-21 stealth bomber and next-generation attack submarines, and modernize U.S. nuclear forces, among other priorities. Republicans on the Senate Armed Services Committee have laid out detailed plans to do this. During the Reagan defense buildup from 1980 to 88, the United States devoted an average of 6.2% of GDP to defense. Even under Jimmy Carter, the U.S. defense spending never dropped below 4.5% of GDP. The myriad of threats we face today are in many ways even more dangerous than those of the Cold War. With an increasingly confrontational Russia, non-state terrorist actors backed by Iran sowing chaos in the Middle East, a regime in North Korea expanding its weapons of mass destruction capabilities, and an adversary in Beijing working feverishly to expand its military power. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has called China the United States' pacing threat. But we can't continue to enact net defense cuts and keep pace with China, much less meet the growing challenge posed by the Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, Pyongyang axis. Raising U.S. defense spending to 5% of GDP would also put to rest the argument that we must abandon Europe to focus on the threat from China. If the U.S. is investing 5% of GDP in defense, and NATO allies raise their spending to at least 3%, we should be able to do both. Our military deterrent has dangerously atrophied under Biden. Trump can restore it. Number 4, shift U.S. troops from Germany to Poland and the Baltic states. Germany has long been the biggest free rider in the NATO alliance. Despite having the largest economy in Europe, in 2023, Germany spent 1.6% of GDP on defense. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Germany announced with great fanfare plans to create a €100 billion supplemental fund to modernize its military. But according to a recent RAND report, already spending pledges are being rolled back. Berlin is projected to just meet the 2% GDP threshold this year. But even if that happens, as soon as the supplemental funds run out, Germany's spending will crash again. By contrast, Poland is spending more than 4% of GDP on defense in 2024 and has plans to reach 5%. Moreover, during the Trump administration, the Polish government offered up to $2 billion to cover the cost of building U.S. bases and supporting U.S. troops in Poland, declaring that it is committed, quote, to share the burden of defense spending and make the decision more cost-effective for the U.S. government, unquote. The Baltic states are also among the few allies exceeding their NATO commitment. Lithuania is spending 2.85% of its GDP on defense. Latvia is spending 3.15%, and Estonia is spending 3.43%. Trump should reward allies who meet their alliance obligations by moving U.S. forces into their territory. He should also consider moving forces to southeastern Europe, and particularly Romania, 2.25% of GDP, which is under increasing Russian threat. This would not just reward good allies, it would also be the right strategic force posture for America. The logic for stationing large number of U.S. forces in Germany no longer exists. The line of contact has moved east, and so should U.S. military bases. In addition, Trump should deploy ballistic missile defenses on the territory of our East European allies. In 2009, the Obama-Biden administration canceled U.S. missile defense agreements with Poland and the Czech Republic in order to appease Moscow. That appeasement clearly failed, as Putin invaded Ukraine on their watch 5 years later. In the wake of Putin's latest aggression, his nuclear saber-rattling, and his decision to move nuclear weapons into Belarus, Trump can reverse the Obama-era decision and deploy ballistic missile defenses to protect NATO allies from Russian nuclear intimidation. This would enhance U.S. security and reward allies who not only meet but exceed their NATO commitments. 5. Force Putin to sue for peace by arming Ukraine. Trump has expressed confidence that he can end the war in Ukraine, but he can go further by offering a credible plan to prevent it from ever starting up again. Trump has said that if Putin does not agree to end Russia's aggression, he will dramatically increase U.S. aid to Ukraine. Quote, I would tell Putin, if you don't make a deal, we're going to give Ukraine a lot. We're going to give them more than they ever got if we have to, he told Maria Bartiromo of Fox News last year. During the CNN presidential debate, Dana Bash asked Trump, quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin says he'll only end this war if Russia keeps the Ukrainian territory it has already claimed and Ukraine abandons its bid to join NATO. Are Putin's terms acceptable to you? When pressed, Trump responded, no, they're not acceptable. He said it twice. And he's right. But getting Putin to accept different terms will require Trump to follow through on his pledge to boost military aid to Kyiv, at least in the short term. The model should be Trump's successful campaign to destroy the Islamic State. Like the war in Ukraine, Trump believes this war was one that he inherited and that should never have happened but for the weakness and incompetence of his predecessor. He won it by removing the handcuffs Barack Obama had placed on our military and achieved decisive victory. He can do the same in Ukraine by giving Kyiv all the weapons that Biden has withheld or slow-rolled and lifting restrictions on their use on Russian territory so Ukraine can regain the offensive. This would create leverage to force Putin to return to the negotiating table. But Trump would also need to make sure that any peace deal he helps strike is irreversible. The danger for Trump is that Putin would wait him out, agree to a temporary ceasefire while Trump is in office, and then resume his conquest once Trump has left and is replaced by a weaker American president. We know because he's done this before. Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 under Obama, paused his conquest under Trump, then resumed it again under Biden in 2022. The only way to stop Putin from attacking again is to make resumption of war impossible. And the only way to do that is to bring Ukraine into NATO with defensible borders. Putin knows he would lose a war with NATO, which is why he has invaded only non-NATO countries. Trump's legacy thus depends on cementing any peace deal by making its lines inviolable. That requires that the boundaries be backed by NATO security guarantees. A Trump-brokered peace deal backed by NATO membership for Ukraine would benefit the U.S. economically. As the Washington Post has reported, quote, Ukraine harbors some of the world's largest reserves of titanium and iron ore, fields of untapped lithium, and massive deposits of coal. Collectively, these are worth tens of trillions of dollars, unquote. Putin wants those natural resources to go to Russia. But if Trump negotiates a lasting peace deal and secures it by bringing Ukraine into NATO, he can get the United States preferential access for those resources. And Ukraine would be a better NATO ally than most of the current member states. It is the most capable, battle-hardened, NATO interoperable military in Europe. Unlike some allies, Ukraine will have no hesitation meeting a NATO obligation to spend 3% of its GDP on defense. It was already spending 3.2% before Russia's full-scale invasion. Kyiv would be a net contributor to European security and thus strengthen the NATO alliance. 6. Finally, globalize NATO to include our Pacific allies. Russia and North Korea just signed a mutual defense treaty in Pyongyang. Russia and China have forged a no-limits partnership that stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Trump should do the same by inviting our major Pacific allies to join the NATO alliance. He should start with Australia and Japan, which meet all the criteria for full NATO membership and could be admitted as easily as Sweden and Finland. Both are thriving democracies who would be net security contributors as NATO allies. Australia just announced a record $37 billion defense budget and is purchasing nuclear submarines from the United States and Britain. Japan has announced plans to raise its spending by $315 billion over the next 5 years, an increase of more than 50% that will give Japan one of the largest defense budgets in the world. Admitting Australia and Japan would create a path for South Korea and perhaps New Zealand to one day join the alliance as well. NATO membership would address one of Trump's main complaints about our alliance with Japan, that the United States has a treaty obligation to defend Tokyo, but that obligation is not reciprocal. Bringing Japan under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty would solve that problem. Australia has long fought beside the United States in wartime. NATO membership would formalize that commitment and extend it to all NATO allies. And it would mean that every NATO ally, not just the United States, is obligated to the collective defense of our Pacific as well as Atlantic democracies. It would foster greater Atlantic-Pacific military-industrial cooperation, increase interoperability of our militaries, and strengthen our deterrent with China, thus imposing a cost on Beijing for funding a proxy war against the West in Ukraine. In addition, expanding NATO to the Pacific would finally bring Hawaii under the protection of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. A lot of people don't know this, but right now Hawaii is not covered because Article 6 limits the treaty's geographic scope to the, quote, North Atlantic area, unquote. So if an adversary attacked, U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, NATO members currently aren't obligated to come to America's defense. That's ridiculous. Each of these steps would be worthy of bipartisan support. But many of the elements of this plan, such as higher defense spending and a willingness to use aggressive leverage on allies, would only be plausible coming from Trump. With these 6 steps, Trump could do more than get allies to spend more. He could remake an alliance forged in the last century and position it to meet the threats of a new one. Today, in the wake of Russia's aggression, China's belligerence, and the growing cooperation between the world's revanchist regimes, the time has come to strengthen NATO with new members, inviolable spending commitments, and consequences for failing to meet them. In short, it is time to make NATO great again. So, Dany, what do you think?
I love this. I think a lot of the things that Trump ended up doing that were good were in some ways accidental, but it only underscores the reality that this sort of chin stroking, Chardonnay swilling, brie eating, diplomatic circuit. Forgive me for sounding like Jesse Helms, but it really doesn't work. What we see is that when we are the tough guys, they're all like, you should definitely spend more. You should do all the work, but stop bossing us
hold your
around.
coat.
Right. But when we do less, they sit there and fret, and maybe they spend a little more, but they still don't do what's necessary. And so Look, there's a Nixon to China element to your piece that I think is true, which is that sometimes the least expected people can do the most important things for American foreign policy just because people are afraid of the crazy things they might do if they don't step up.
No, I agree with that 100%. I mean, look, I remember reading, and I think I don't know if we've talked about this in the podcast before, but our friend Peter Schweitzer wrote a great book at the end of the Cold War called Victory. And it was the first effort right after the Berlin Wall collapsed to push back on this narrative. Well, that, communism wasn't pushed, it fell. Right? It fell of its own weight and its own internal contradictions and all the rest of it. He's like, no, there was a strategy to do this. Ronald Reagan had a plan. We win, they lose, and he implemented it and he laid it all out. And then a few years later, the Russians had, because their economy was collapsing, they sold all their archives to the Hoover Institution. And so Peter was able to go to Hoover and go into the minutes of the Politburo meeting. And what he discovered was that the Russians actually believed the propaganda that Ronald Reagan wanted to start a nuclear war and that he would actually launch a nuclear first strike. They thought he was crazy. All the left-wing crazy propaganda about Reagan and how he was a warmonger and all the rest. Because, of course, we all look back on Reagan now with fondness because we all got along during the Reagan years and no one ever opposed Ronald Reagan. This was back when we were a country that was united in defeating communism.
It was totally like that.
It was totally like that. And no, they said that Ronald Reagan was a warmonger and he was going to start a war and we need to go back to détente and get along and peaceful coexistence and all the rest of them. And all this we win, they lose stuff was dangerous. And the Soviets believed it. They believed the propaganda. And so as a result, he had enormous leverage with them when they finally got a general secretary he could talk to. I think a lot of it's the same way with Trump in that I think a lot of what people say about him and a lot of what he says himself leads them to believe that he's a little crazy and he might do some of the things that he says he might do. And so that gives him leverage. And I think he knows it. And I think that he's probably the only president who could get NATO to do some of this stuff.
I want to ask you a question that maybe you won't expect and maybe our listeners won't expect. One of the things that I, as a manager, when I brought Marc on at AEI, and I know that my successor, Corey Shockey, really appreciates, is that when you write an article like this, you reach out to the resources that the American Enterprise Institute has to offer, right? When you're writing something about education or about the economy or about whatever it is, you reach out to our experts. And ditto, you reached out to our little foreign and defense policy family and you said, hey guys, I'm writing this. What do you think? And the result was a very interesting conversation, some interesting pushback. And again, AEI is not, I won't badmouth other institutions, but AEI is not a...
I do it all the time.
I noticed.
Heritage Foundation.
Yes, AEI is not Project 2025. We don't all have uniform views, and I think it's part of what makes us strong. And you had some disagreement with our colleagues about what the right things were. What do you think is the most controversial part, just based on your conversations with our colleagues? What do you think is the most controversial part of this manifesto for a new, great, not really North Atlantic treaty organization?
So number one, the most controversial was crediting Trump with the spending increases was one of them. I think a lot of people didn't agree with that. And
were there objections, right?
No, not numerically, I don't think. But I think what the objection was, and I don't want to speak for anybody, but some people said that even if he got them to spend more, the fact that he called Article 5 into question weakens the alliance. And so, yes, it might be militarily stronger, but its perception of its resolve might be weaker. And so therefore that weakens NATO. And I understand that argument. I just disagree with it, I think. And I disagree with it from the perspective of somebody who was a speechwriter for the Secretary of Defense and for the President of the United States, who attended probably almost a dozen NATO summits and defense ministerials in which I wrote the speeches for the President of the Secretary of Defense, urging allies to meet their spending commitments, which they promptly ignored and never did. And at some point, you have to use real bullets.
Well, it's not just that, Marc. It's not just that. I will say, I think it's really important to underscore something that you were nice enough not to call out people on this front. But it's not, the sin is not Donald Trump recognizing that NATO is not as strong as it used to be and not as strong as it should be and is only as strong as its weakest link. Because that's what everybody else says in fancy Diplo language. The real point here is that Donald Trump recognized that our allies were disinvesting in NATO. It's not that they weren't putting up the money. It was that they didn't think it was worth it compared to the other investments that they could make. And this is a very ugly conversation that we never have about our European allies. But that's what they were doing. They weren't going around saying, ugh, who cares about Montenegro, like Donald Trump was, which was vulgar and not right for an American president. They were just voting with their feet. This isn't worth our money. We'd much rather spend it on our social services and our social safety net and giving people a 5-hour workday.
No, it's exactly right. They've been funding socialism on the backs of the American taxpayer in Europe. Because for all this time, NATO wasn't weakened only because the United States continued to spend at high levels on defense and was able to, and they were just depending on us to defend them. And so they were disinvesting and not carrying their weight. And Donald Trump, it wasn't just that they were not carrying their weight, but they were fleecing the United States and fleecing American taxpayers by not being net contributors. It's called collective security for a reason. It's supposed to be collective, and everybody's supposed to contribute to it.
They collect and we pay.
Exactly. They collect and exactly right. And so literally what Trump did was he made a threat and he fired with real bullets in order to the fact that NATO could fire with real bullets. Because literally, Dany, you and I remember this when Obama launched that misbegotten NATO operation in Libya, the British and French ran out of precision missiles in less than a month and ended up dropping concrete training bombs on sites in Libya, and all these people. I remember I went back and looked at all the news reports about it. I was going to include it in the piece, and then it was getting too long, so I didn't want to belabor it. But I went back to look at all the news reports, and they said, "Isn't this wonderful? Because this is reducing civilian casualties." It's like, no, it's not because they're trying to reduce civilian casualties. It was because they didn't have them. Because they've been disinvesting because they were long after we had stopped collecting a post-Cold War peace dividend, they continued to collect. And they were able to continue collecting because we didn't.
Exactly.
Because we stopped and we started rebuilding our defenses. And so Trump is absolutely correct in insisting that they do it. And I think in the next term, he should say, you know what? 2%, not good enough.
3%.
Not good enough. 3%. The other thing was controversial was putting in the NATO charter, opening up the treaty to amendment and how that could be complicated.
I'm sorry, just hang on a second, because one thing you were gracious enough not to put in here, and in some senses you were right, and I didn't raise it when you sent around your email, is the fact that we have an alliance that includes Turkey. And the terms of the NATO treaty mean that we can't kick Turkey out. Turkey, which bought an S-400 surface-to-air missile system from the Russians at the same time that they were trying to do business with us on the F-35.
Yeah.
Turkey, which supports Hamas. Turkey, which didn't support us in Syria when we were trying to support pro-democracy activists. Turkey, that is an Islamist wannabe caliphate with a dictator at the helm who seeks to revive the Ottoman Empire, but only the worst part of the Ottoman Empire, not the good parts. That is another huge problem with NATO that would have required even more pages than the Washington Post. And if you opened up the treaty, you could actually do something about the fact that we have inside NATO a quote-unquote ally that supports Hamas, that has supported ISIS, that has killed innumerable civilians through their support for terrorism, and is helping Russia and giving money to Russia. So if we opened it up, we could do that too. That would be amazing. Yay for you.
Yeah, we might even look at Hungary too.
Yes. Exactly. No, seriously.
Yep.
Listen, an alliance should mean something. The reason the League of Nations fell apart was because it was nothing other than a piece of paper. The reason Munich fell apart was because it was nothing other than a piece of paper. It's time. I hate that expression. Make anything great again. It just drives me insane. But you know what? This
He liked it when
shouldn't
Ronald
just be
Reagan
a
said it
piece-
because that was his line when he
Yeah,
announced his
yeah, yeah.
presidential campaign.
But we should actually. These are ideas and others that could make NATO great again. As all of you sit down and watch our poor president shuffle and mumble his way through hosting the 75th anniversary. If only he were 75. God, that would be so great. The 75th anniversary of NATO and of the creation of NATO in Washington, D.C. this week. Think about the things you've heard in this podcast, the ideas you heard in Marc's piece in the Washington Post, and say to yourself, couldn't we make this better? Isn't
I
this
think
an
we can.
opportunity that yet another opportunity that poor, sad Joe Biden is missing? He is.
Awesome. This was great,
Take care,
Dany. Let's keep
everybody.
doing this.
Yep. Take care, everyone. Let us know what you think. And like you, we're sitting here waiting for the president to decide what's going to happen to his future or the Democratic Party. So in the meantime, it's worthwhile thinking about ways we can make the country a little bit better. Thanks for being with us.
I'm off to Milwaukee for the Republican convention next week, so maybe we'll get some good content from Milwaukee.
Oh, no matter what, it's going to be good. I can't wait. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Marc Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.